Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Hernandez. I am not Will Shanner. I'm sorry to disappoint or save you from that. Um, I am a web journalism professor at USC Annenberg, ONA board member, and today your moderator for our discussion on net neutrality. Before we begin our discussion and introduce our invited panelists, I want to take a moment to point out some of the features we have in this new software we're using called Watch It 2. You've already registered to come into the chat, and on the right side of your screen, you shall see a chat room where you can actively participate in the discussion. This is a dialogue not only with the panelists, but also with you and the audience, the attendees. And also in that area, you should see a tab called the Questions tab. This is where we want you to submit your questions, and it's part of the feature of Watch It 2 and how we'll bring it and present it to the panelists. We also encourage you to submit your questions through Twitter using the hashtag ONA Issues, # ONA Issues. Again, like I said, this is an active dialogue, and so we want you to participate, submit questions, submit your thoughts, and let's have a good discussion about net neutrality. So let me introduce our guests. First guest is Kat Aaron. She's the project editor at Investigative Reporting Workshop in DC. Earlier this year, she wrote a piece titled News Organizations Should Stop Being Neutral on Net Neutrality, which was published on PBS's Media Shift. Kat, thank you for joining us. She should be popping up soon. Our next panelist is J.G. Harrington. He's a telecommunications lawyer in Washington, D.C. with the firm Dow Lohnes. In December of last year, he wrote a 12-page memo synthesizing, condensing the FCC order, which was originally 200 pages long. Not an easy task. Thank you, JG, for joining us today as well. And our last panelist is Maggie Reardon. She's a senior writer at CNET.com, based in New York. And she's been reporting on a variety of issues, specifically net neutrality, through her blog, Signal Strength, where she covers all things wireless broadband, and she wrote a few months back a great FAQ on net neutrality. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us. Let's see if we can get their videos queued up. Let's just do a sound check. Everyone can hear and see me. Please say hello.
Yeah. Hello.
JG?
I'm here.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And
thank you guys for joining us for our discussion today. Thank you guys. So let's start with the most basic of questions when it comes to net neutrality and define what the heck it is. JG, can you define net neutrality for us and maybe perhaps the FCC term?
Sure. The FCC likes the term open internet, in fact, rather than network neutrality. Their definition is really focused on the notion, as they put it in the order, of a network that is open in the sense that it has no gatekeepers limiting innovation and communication through the network. Operationally, the FCC thinks of that as really comprising three components: transparency, no blocking, and no unreasonable discrimination. There's obviously a lot of room for interpretation in all of those things, but that is how the FCC looks at it.
Okay. And, you know, if you were to break it down to layman speak, how would you say that? How would you describe that? Someone want to?
I would describe the FCC's view on how to break it down in layman's terms likely would be that customers get to use the internet to use the applications and services that they want to use without undue interference from the service provider.
Okay, okay. And Maggie, you've been covering the issue for some time. There's been lots of developments over the years. What are some recent developments and what is next?
What is next? Well, I guess, you know, one of the developments is that the order is actually being challenged in court, and a federal court threw out Verizon's challenge, mostly because it said that it was too early to file the challenge in that particular court. But I think what we're going to see coming up next is just a whole string of court cases, and we'll have to see. I think that's probably going to play out over the next couple of years, and we'll have to wait and see if the order even really is able to be implemented. I don't know if JG has some thoughts on that, on what he thinks the timeline will be like, or if it'll even get implemented.
JG?
Right. Well, as of now, the order's not in effect. The FCC decided that it wouldn't go into effect until 60 days after the order was published in the Federal Register, which hasn't happened. The expectation is that will probably happen sometime in May or possibly early June, at which point the court challenges will really start. The timeline for the court challenges depends a lot on the court, but I think it's likely to take at least 6 months to a year at the first level, and then there'll be the question of whether we'll end up going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court may not be that anxious to take on this case one way or the other, but certainly we're going to be looking at the appeals for 6 months to a year after the order is supposed to become effective. One key question along the way will be, will the court stop it from being effective or let it go into effect while the appeal is continuing? And that'll be an early sign of whether the court's likely to overturn the decision. If the court lets it stay in effect, the FCC is more likely to win. If the court stays the order and prevents it from going into effect, then the opponents are more likely to win.
Speaking of opponents, Maggie, can you tell us the stakeholders, the folks that have come out on either side, and maybe even talk about what is a pro side and what is a con side? Can you kind of define that for us?
Yeah, sure. I guess, on the con side, you've got all the major broadband providers, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast to some extent, all the major, but mostly AT&T and Verizon, who are very much opposed to, well, first of all, they feel that the FCC has the authority to implement some of this regulation. So that's one issue. And they've definitely come out against rules that would apply to anything wireless. They don't want net neutrality or open internet rules to apply to wireless type things. So you've got those folks on one side, and then on the other side, you've got a lot of consumer groups. Initially, Google was kind of in that camp. They were a big driver of open internet, although they've backed off in recent, in probably like the last year or so. But you've got a lot of the internet players, Amazon, and some big names like that, eBay, that are in favor of having open internet or net neutrality rules. So those are basically the two sides. And really what they want to see happen is kind of rules of the road in place so that the folks who actually own the infrastructure, the broadband providers, can't monkey with traffic and somehow favor their own services over a competitor service. What this really comes down to is you've got services like Netflix, for example, right? I canceled my cable subscription 2 weeks ago. I don't watch television over cable anymore. I get it from Netflix. So in a sense, that is a direct competitor to what Time Warner offers. And so now that's become a competitor. But at the same time, Netflix is being delivered to me over a Time Warner broadband connection. So Time Warner, some people would argue, has an incentive to monkey with the traffic, somehow slow it down, or make the quality not as good, or make it more difficult for me to watch my video via Netflix, so that I don't cancel my cable subscription and I still continue to pay them $120 a month.
And there was a case that actually happened, right? I don't recall if it was Verizon, but there was a throttling.
That was Comcast, and it wasn't
Comcast,
really.
thank you.
I think it was that case was a little misunderstood in the sense that they were slowing down BitTorrent traffic. So
yes.
The big problem there was that they had singled out a particular type of traffic. Comcast was saying, we slowed down that traffic because it was overwhelming our network, and we had to manage our traffic, and the only way to do that is to do it this way. But I think really in that incident, it was more a matter of trying to manage the network and not a policy that they wanted to kill BitTorrent traffic on their network.
And that's
just my
the
opinion.
argument. And that's the argument from the con side, right? Not the owners of those pipes have the ability to adjust their internet traffic to preserve the stability of those pipes. Is that a fair description of those against
and that's
net
a fair
neutrality?
description, and exactly, and I think that people have to recognize that the internet has always had quality of service on it. So you've always had providers who have had to manage their traffic to make sure that service can get through. You've always had providers paying each other for access to networks. So that's nothing new.
Yeah. Okay. You said something earlier, since I think we're in the stage of
the FCC rules.
Please, JG.
Yeah, the FCC's rules actually specifically recognize network management as something that the providers can do. And one of the key questions under the rules is what's okay network management and what's not. So the FCC probably still wouldn't like what Comcast did in the BitTorrent case, but there are a lot of things that the FCC probably would allow under the rules.
Okay. And Maggie, you said something earlier that I feel like we're in the stage of defining this debate and this discussion about the difference between wired and mobile. JG, what are the differences that are outlined in terms of is there a difference between how wired and mobile wireless are being viewed?
Yes, there is. Under the FCC's rules, really, as a general principle, more requirements apply to wired than to wireless. And in particular, the wired services are subject to an anti-discrimination rule that is what it sounds like. You can't unreasonably discriminate between different kinds of services and platforms that people want to use. Wireless services are not subject to that rule. The other important distinction is that the FCC has an anti-blocking rule that says that wired providers can't block anything. For wireless providers, that's limited to services and applications that compete with their existing voice and video products. So, for instance, where a wired provider under the rules wouldn't be allowed to discriminate between providers of Sudoku puzzles, a wireless provider actually would.
And that was a big point of contention between the agreement or the compromise between Verizon and Google, right? They made an informal agreement about wired, but even Google seemed to back off on the mobile space. Is that a right interpretation of that, Maggie?
Yeah, and I would say that you have to look at where Google's interests are.
Yes.
On the wired side, they're not really paired up with any killer broadband provider. But on the wireless side, they have a big interest in working with the carriers. They own the Google Android software, and that platform is on every major wireless carrier in the U.S. So, they have a big stake in working with carriers. So I think to a certain extent, you have to look at where their bread is buttered, right?
Yeah. And mobile is growing. It's up and coming. Wired, we've established to a certain extent, but mobile is the new space. Is that accurate, both of you?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that wired internet is not growing. I think that, I think there's only 60% of the U.S. population that has what's considered a high-speed broadband connection. And I think the hope is that more people will have a connection going forward. So I wouldn't say that it's not growing, but certainly wireless broadband is exploding, and it's mostly because more people are getting smartphones, and there are going to be more devices that are going to be connected to the internet via a wireless connection. So yeah, we're going to see a huge explosion, and people are going to be using the internet in different ways. So they're going to be wanting to get to different types of applications, and to a certain extent, what a lot of the application developers are saying and content folks are saying and consumer folks are saying, why should this be treated any differently than the wired network? This is how people are going to be accessing the internet of the future,
Yes.
and it shouldn't be hamstrung.